The 15-foot alien queen laughed at me until I made her kneel. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The grating sound of his boots being dragged across polished obsidian was the only rhythm in a world of oppressive heat and suffocating silence. Caleb's arms, wrenched back at an agonizing angle by the colossal guards, felt numb, the pain a distant echo of the far greater ache of total defeat. Each jarring step sent a fresh wave of throbbing through his skull, a reminder of the blow that had finally brought him down after the rest of his unit had been reduced to scorched earth and memories. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at the 10-foot behemoths flanking him, their golden skin gleaming under the strange, ambient light of the hall, their faces set in the same expression of casual contempt he had seen on every soldier. They were a species built on the virtue of scale, and he was, by their measure, insignificant. The air itself was a presence, thick with the smell of sulfur and superheated rock, and it shimmered in visible waves, distorting the impossibly vast chamber he was being forced through. This was not a building in any human sense of the word. It was a cavity, a hollowed-out god mountain of volcanic glass, its walls streaked with veins of what looked like captured lava, flowing in lazy, menacing rivers behind sheets of translucent crystal. It was a throne hall designed to crush the spirit long before the body, a monument to a power that was absolute and geological in its scope. And at its heart, upon a throne that looked like a cooled and shattered meteorite, sat the source of that power. Queen of the Empire was not merely large. She was a landmark. Seated, she was still taller than the guards who held him captive, a queen of living gold and obsidian-black hair that cascaded over the jagged shoulders of her jeweled armor. He had seen countless data-slate images of her, but they were sterile and two-dimensional, utterly failing to capture the sheer presence that radiated from her, a palpable aura of predatory authority that pressed down on him as he drew closer. Her crimson eyes, burning with a light that seemed to come from within, fixed on him, and the casual disinterest in them was more insulting than any overt hatred could ever be. She made a languid gesture with a hand that could have crushed his torso, and her guards halted, forcing him to his knees 100 feet from the base of her throne. The impact on the hard stone sent a jolt up his spine, but he locked his jaw and forced his head up, meeting her gaze. He would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him bow. A low, resonant sound began to build in her chest, and then it spilled from her lips, a laugh. It was not a sound of mirth but of profound, unassailable arrogance, a deep, musical boom that echoed off the obsidian walls and seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The assembled court of nobles and warriors, all of them giants in their own right, joined in her amusement, their collective laughter a tidal wave of mockery that washed over him. "This is it." Queen's voice was as vast as her hall, each word laced with the languid power of a being who had never known a true challenge, a voice that could command fleets and shatter worlds without ever needing to be raised. "This is the creature that led my high general on a merry chase across the ashen wastes. I had pictured something more formidable than a stunted, dirt-smeared primate." She leaned forward slightly, her crimson eyes narrowing as she studied him like a curious piece of flotsam washed up on her shores. "They tell me your species is tenacious, human, that you have a capacity for surprising violence. Yet all I see is a broken soldier, the last remnant of a failed strategy. Tell me, Caleb of the Terran Alliance, what is the grand design of your people? To die in pointless last stands on worlds you have no hope of holding. To throw your fragile bodies against an empire as old as your star." Caleb's own voice, when he finally used it, was a dry rasp, the dust of clinging to his throat. "We have a saying, Your Majesty. It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a momentary spark of interest that was quickly extinguished by her all-consuming pride. She found his defiance quaint, a final, amusing squeak from a creature about to be crushed. "Courage is a luxury of the deluded," she pronounced, settling back into her throne, the jewels on her armor scattering the lava light in 1,000 blood-red shards. It is a fiction you tell yourselves to make the inevitable palatable. Your tenacity is meaningless. Your violence is insignificant. Your entire civilization is a brief, noisy flash in a galaxy that has belonged to the Imperium for and will belong to us for more. My forces conquered your primary outpost on this moon in a single planetary cycle. Your vaunted fleet was crippled before it could even deploy its capital ships. And your elite unit, your phantoms, were annihilated to the last man, except for you. Why did you survive when your comrades fell? Did you run? Did you hide while they were being slaughtered? The question was a deliberate, precisely aimed barb designed to pierce his soldiers' honor. He could feel the raw grief for his men clawing at his insides, a fresh, searing wound. He saw their faces in his mind, heard the final, desperate comms chatter before it was all cut to static. That grief, that rage, it wasn't a weakness. It was a lens focusing his thoughts, burning away the fog of pain and despair and leaving only a single, desperate, diamond-hard point of clarity. He had one chance, not to survive necessarily, but to act, to do something that mattered. To wipe the smug, ancient certainty off her perfect golden face. He had spent the last 3 days in a holding cell after his capture, listening. He learned their cadences, the guttural stops and flowing vowels of their language. And from one guard boasting to another about a disgraced commander, he learned of the ultimate insult, a phrase that didn't just question one's honor but attacked the very foundation of their being, the legitimacy of their strength. He took a breath, letting it fill him with the superheated air of her hall, and when he spoke, he did not use his own tongue. His pronunciation was rough with a human accent, but the words were unmistakable to every present. Your strength is a hollow stone, a shell borrowed from the conquests of your ancestors. You rule from a throne of glass, Queen, and you have forgotten the feel of the mountain. A wave of shocked silence, so profound it was like a physical force, slammed through the hall. The laughter died in 1,000 giant throats. The guards' grips on his arms tightened, their knuckles white. Every single crimson eye was fixed on him, no longer with amusement but with a sudden, sharp, murderous attention. He had not just insulted her, he had committed a form of cultural blasphemy, accusing her of being a parasite on the legacy of her own empire, of being weak at her very core. Reaction was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. The amused contempt vanished from her face, replaced by a mask of pure glacial fury. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop, the oppressive heat leached away by the sheer coldness of her rage. She rose from her throne. It was a process, a tectonic unfolding of power and scale. She just kept going up, a golden goddess of war uncoiling to her full, magnificent 15 feet of height. The shadow she cast fell over him, a promise of imminent oblivion. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer a resonant boom but a low, deadly whisper that carried to every corner of the obsidian chamber. I am going to tear the tongue from your head, human, and then I will keep you alive for a very long time, to feel the true strength of the mountain you so foolishly named. She took a step down from her dais, her movements fluid and lethal, like a predator closing in for the final, satisfying kill. Her hand, a thing of terrible grace and strength, was raised, ready to strike him down, to make an example of his insolence that would be told for centuries. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for, the opening he had purchased with his life. His own hand, chained as it was not entirely useless. His fingers, scraped and bloody, fumbled at his wrist, finding the nearly invisible seam of the chronometer he wore. It wasn't a timepiece. It was a prototype. The last piece of high-frequency tech his unit had been testing before the end. With a final, desperate act of will, Caleb depressed the hidden activation stud. There was no sound, no flash of light, nothing to mark its activation to the human eye or ear. But for the whose entire sense of balance and spatial awareness was governed by a unique and highly sensitive inner ear structure, the silent, high-frequency pulse was a cataclysm. For Queen, it was as if the universe had suddenly tilted on its axis. A look of utter shock and disbelief washed over her face, replacing the fury. Her crimson eyes widened as a silent, invisible force slammed into her senses, scrambling her equilibrium and sending her exquisitely honed motor functions into chaos. Her raised hand faltered. Her body, a moment ago a paradigm of lethal grace, became a prison. Her muscles locked, spasming uncontrollably. A guttural cry, not of pain but of pure, uncomprehending outrage, was ripped from her throat as she fought against her own rebelling physiology. The forward momentum of her stride carried her, but her legs would no longer obey her. She stumbled, her movements suddenly clumsy and uncoordinated. And then, with the entire court watching in frozen, horrified disbelief, the 15-foot queen of the Imperium, the warrior monarch of 1,000 worlds, crashed down. She did not fall completely, but her powerful legs buckled beneath her, and she landed with a thunderous clang of armored plates and a sharp crack of stone on the obsidian floor, caught on a single, bent knee. She was kneeling. Paralyzed and helpless, her magnificent form was brought low, forced into a posture of submission, directly before the small, defiant human prisoner she had been about to kill. The hall was utterly, profoundly silent, the only sound the faint, menacing hum of lava flowing behind crystal walls. The silence in the throne hall was absolute, a crushing void where the echoes of laughter and power had once been. It stretched, thin and brittle, until it felt as though the obsidian walls themselves might crack under the strain. Every eye, from the lowest ranking guard to the most esteemed noble, was fixed on the impossible tableau. Their queen, a demigod of conquest and strength, forced to one knee before a chained and broken creature from a species they considered little more than vermin. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm in the profound stillness, yet he kept his gaze locked on. He saw the progression of emotions in her crimson eyes as the effects of the sonic pulse began to fade, a swift and terrifying storm of shock giving way to uncomprehending fury, which in turn was consumed by a humiliation so deep and poisonous it seemed to radiate from her like heat. Her golden skin was flushed, and a muscle in her jaw twitched as she fought to regain control of her own monumental form. With a shuddering groan of protesting metal and straining sinew, she pushed herself upright, the sound of her armored knee leaving the floor like a thunderclap in the silence. The guards, finally jolted from their paralysis, surged forward, their massive forms a wall of impending death, their weapons raised to atomize the source of their monarch's shame. But before they could strike, her voice cut through the air, not a shout but a low, serrated command that stopped them dead. "Stop! Do not touch him!" She did not look at her guards. Her burning gaze remained fixed on Caleb, a look of such intensity it felt like a physical weight. She was no longer studying a curiosity. She was dissecting an anomaly, an equation that the fundamental mathematics of her universe, where might was the only variable that mattered. He had introduced a new number, something she did not understand, and her entire being recoiled from it while simultaneously being drawn to it with a terrifying fascination. "Take him," she commanded, her voice resonating with restored, if shaken, authority. "To my personal wing. Confine him to the antechamber of the northern spire. Post the Imperial Guard. No one is to enter or leave without my direct command." A collective ripple of shock passed through the assembled court, a murmur of disbelief that was quickly silenced by a single glare from the Queen. High General, his face a mask of rigid control, took a half-step forward, his voice a low rumble of concern. "Your Majesty, his crime demands a public and immediate." Head snapped towards him, her eyes narrowing to blood-red slits. "Did you misunderstand my command, General, or do you wish to challenge it?" Froze, the subtle challenge in his posture vanishing as he gave a stiff, formal bow. "No, Your Majesty." As the guards hauled Caleb to his feet, their grips now laced with a new kind of violence, one born of confusion and rage, he caught the general's eye. He saw no loyalty there, only a cold, calculating opportunism, the look of a predator that had just scented a weakness in the pack leader. Then he was being dragged away, out of the vast throne hall and into the private, forbidden corridors of the Queen, his desperate gambit having succeeded not in freeing him, but in plunging him into an entirely new and infinitely more dangerous kind of captivity. His new prison was a cage of breathtaking opulence and crushing scale. The chamber was circular, its walls sweeping upwards to a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow, with a single vast, unbarred window that looked out over a landscape of volcanic peaks and rivers of fire. The furniture was sparse and built for a giant. A divan carved from a single piece of obsidian was the size of a human transport vehicle, and a table of polished, cooled lava could have served as a landing pad. He was a miniature in a dollhouse built for a god. The air hummed with a low, constant energy, and the silence was a stark contrast to the clanging brutality of the dungeons he had expected. A few hours after his arrival, the immense stone door slid open, and Queen entered alone. She had shed the more ceremonial elements of her armor, leaving her in a form-fitting underlayer of black, articulated plates that accentuated her impossible curves and the sheer power of her physique. In this less formal setting, without the trappings of her throne, her presence was somehow even more overwhelming. She sealed the door behind her and for a long moment simply stood there, observing him as he stood in the center of the vast room, the chains still binding his wrists. The power dynamic was still absurdly skewed, yet something had irrevocably shifted. He was her captive, but the key to his own humiliation was locked somewhere inside his mind, and she knew it. "The device," she began, her voice a controlled, dangerous purr. "You will give it to me and you will explain its function." Caleb met her gaze without flinching, his mind racing. His defiance in the throne room had been an act of desperation. His silence now was a calculated strategy for survival. The sonic disruptor was his only piece of leverage, the only thing standing between him and a very slow, very inventive death. "It was destroyed in my capture," he lied, his voice steady. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "Do not mistake my curiosity for patience, human. My technicians will strip you down to your component atoms to find what you used against me. A verbal explanation will be significantly less intrusive." He remained silent, letting the threat hang in the air. He was gambling that her need to understand would outweigh her desire for immediate, brutal retribution. She began to pace, her steps silent despite her size, her movements filled with a caged energy that made the vast chamber feel small and claustrophobic. "Your species is known for your primitive but occasionally effective projectile and energy weapons. We have studied your designs. They are crude, relying on brute force. But this was something else. It was silent, invisible, yet it targeted my physiology with a precision that suggests a deep understanding of our biology. An understanding you should not possess." He gave her nothing, his face a mask of disciplined neutrality he had learned over years of special forces training. This was just another interrogation, albeit one where the interrogator could snap his spine with one hand. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light of the angry sun filtering through the massive window. Their confrontations became a routine, a series of intellectual and psychological duels. She would enter, sometimes in a fury, sometimes with a cold, analytical calm, and demand answers. He would parry, deflect, and endure. Through these tense exchanges, the pieces of their respective worlds began to take shape. He learned that her throne was a precarious perch, that her rule was a constant battle against ambitious generals like and ancient noble houses who saw her as an upstart. Her empire's brutality was not born of malice, but of necessity, a reflection of their harsh, volcanic world where only the absolute strongest could survive and rule. She, in turn, began to learn about humanity, a species that compensated for its physical frailty with relentless ingenuity and a stubborn, infuriating refusal to accept defeat. She could not comprehend the concept of fighting for an ideal, or for the person standing next to you, a stark contrast to her own culture where loyalty was a currency traded for power and position. During one particularly heated argument, she sneered at his unit's ultimate failure. "You sacrificed your entire command for what? To delay my conquest of a worthless moon by a few hours, a pointless gesture." That was the opening he had been waiting for, a chance to move the battle from the ground of her choosing to his. "It wasn't a gesture, it was a calculation," he stated, his tone shifting from defiant prisoner to professional soldier. "And it wasn't pointless. Your fleet's victory was assured, but its execution was flawed. Your high general, in his haste, relied on overwhelming firepower from his capital ships, pushing them forward in a brute force assault. He neglected to properly deploy a layered picket screen of destroyer-class vessels to protect their flanks from smaller, faster-moving threats. Stopped packing, turning to face him fully, a dangerous stillness in her posture. "You are telling me you see a flaw in the tactics of a high general?" she asked, her voice dripping with incredulity. Caleb pressed on, undeterred. "He saw our fleet as something to be smashed, not outmaneuvered. My unit didn't engage your battleships. We used the chaos of the main assault to slip through a gap in your western picket screen, a gap that should never have existed. We weren't making a last stand. We were on a targeted strike. We took out 2 of your supply cruisers, the Fist of Magma and the Pride, before his forces could react and overwhelm us. Those cruisers were carrying the primary siege cannons and the ground-penetrating ordnance for the planetary assault. Their destruction didn't just delay you by a few hours. It delayed your ground invasion by 3 full cycles, enough time for over 80,000 civilian and non-essential personnel to evacuate the primary colony. My unit didn't die for a rock. They died for them." The silence that followed his explanation was heavier than any that had come before. He had not just criticized her tactics. He had given the sacrifice of his men a profound and strategic meaning, transforming their annihilation from a defeat into a successful, if costly, military objective. He could see the war of emotions on her face. Her pride was incensed that a lesser being would dare to critique her empire's military doctrine, yet the cold, hard logic of his statement was undeniable. Without another word, she turned and swept from the room, the door sealing behind her with a definitive boom, leaving Caleb alone in the sudden quiet, his heart pounding with the knowledge that he had either just sealed his own death warrant or fundamentally changed the rules of his imprisonment. Hours later, in her private command center deep in the heart of the mountain, replayed the holographic logs of the battle for the Ashen Moon. She stripped away the triumphant narratives of her generals and watched the raw data, the cold, uncaring vectors of ships and weapons fire. And there it was, exactly as the human had described. A temporary but significant gap in the picket screen, 2 cruisers moving into a vulnerable position, and a small, swift energy signature, his unit, slipping through the void to deliver a killing blow before being consumed by fire. He was right. The dirt-smeared primate in her chambers, the insolent creature she had nearly killed, had possessed a clearer tactical overview of the battle than her own decorated high general. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a complex sound of fury, frustration, and a deeply unsettling, utterly infuriating spark of grudging respect. When she returned to his chamber late in the next cycle, the atmosphere was different. The raw, violent anger was gone, replaced by a cold, penetrating intensity. She did not ask about the device. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time, not as an insult to be avenged, but as a weapon to be understood. "What was your rank, human?" she asked, her voice devoid of its earlier mockery. "And what, precisely, was your operational specialty?" A fragile and unspoken truce settled in the opulent chamber, altering the very atmosphere of Caleb's gilded captivity. The interrogations, once raw displays of dominance and defiance, transformed into something far more complex and dangerous: strategic dialogues. Queen would spend hours with him, not questioning his past or his people's motives, but presenting him with hypothetical military scenarios, ancient war campaigns, and current fleet dispositions. She treated him less like a prisoner and more like a strange, captured oracle of war, a unique tactical puzzle she was determined to solve. She would pace the vast obsidian floor before the window overlooking fiery heart, her magnificent form silhouetted against the inferno, and describe a pincer movement against the Nebula Pirates or a siege strategy for the crystalline moons of Cygnus 10-1. She never asked for his opinion directly. Instead, she would state her intended course of action with an air of absolute finality, a subtle challenge daring him to find a flaw. And Caleb, understanding the delicate dance they were engaged in, would dissect her plans with a cold, dispassionate logic, pointing out potential overextensions, supply line vulnerabilities, or the psychological factors of an enemy she viewed as little more than a pest. He learned to frame his critiques not as corrections, but as alternative perspectives, observations that a commander, bred for glorious head-on assaults, might overlook. It was a perilous game of intellect and ego, a continuous battle where the prize was not freedom, but a fragile, growing respect that was the only thing keeping him alive. From his vantage point in the northern spire, Caleb had a commander's view of the Citadel's central courtyard, a massive plaza of polished stone where the shifts of the Imperial Guard were conducted. For the first few cycles, it was a routine he came to know well, a display of the disciplined but imperfect might of the military. The guards, while immense and powerful, had the pragmatic bearing of veteran soldiers. Their armor bore the nicks and scuffs of real combat, their formations were efficient rather than ceremonial, and their interactions were those of a brotherhood forged in battle. Then one cycle he noticed a change. It began subtly, with the replacement of a handful of guards, but within a day, the entire contingent that patrolled the Queen's wing had been swapped out. The new soldiers were different. Their armor was immaculate, polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the lava flows with unnerving perfection. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, their patrol routes executed with a geometric precision that spoke more of endless drilling on a parade ground than the fluid adaptability required for actual security. They marched with a rigid, almost artificial uniformity, their crimson eyes fixed forward, devoid of the casual awareness he had seen in their predecessors. To any, this new guard would have appeared as a superior, more disciplined force, a testament to the Empire's might. To Caleb, it was a blaring alarm, a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of true security. A real guard watches for the unexpected, their patterns intentionally varied, their focus outward. This new force was performing, their focus inward, their discipline a brittle shell designed to impress, not to protect. He watched them for 2 more cycles, his unease solidifying into a cold certainty. The new guards were all loyalists to High General. He recognized the divisional insignia on there, a subtle variant he had noted during his initial, humiliating procession through the throne room. The previous guards had been from his own ancestral cadre, warriors whose families had served her line for generations. This was not a simple rotation of duty. It was a strategic replacement, a quiet coup of the Queen's immediate security detail. Was positioning his own pieces on the board, surrounding the Queen with soldiers whose ultimate loyalty was to him. Caleb's mind, trained to see patterns and anticipate threats, began to assemble the pieces. His public humiliation at his hands had created a perception of weakness. Her subsequent fascination with him, keeping him alive and consulting with him, would be seen by a ruthlessly ambitious subordinate not as a clever use of a new asset, but as a sign of corruption, a mental failing, a deviation from the sacred ideal of absolute strength. Was not just ambitious, he was a cultural purist. He saw a queen tainted by an alien influence, and he was creating the perfect conditions to remove that taint and seize power for himself, likely under the guise of restoring the Empire's honor. The meticulously perfect guards were not for her protection. They were her jailers, positioned to ensure that when the blow came, no one loyal to her would be able to intervene. He needed to warn her, but the opportunity had to be perfect. She was a monarch whose entire identity was built upon projecting unassailable strength, and an unsubstantiated warning from a prisoner and off would be seen as a desperate ploy, an attempt to sow discord. He waited until her next visit, when she was deep in a discussion about a proposed blockade of a rebellious system. She outlined her strategy, a massive show of force designed to cow the population into submission. "It's a clean strategy," Caleb countered, choosing his words with surgical precision. "But it's loud. It announces your presence and your intent to the entire sector. You're assuming the rebellion is a matter of planetary pride, something that can be broken by a show of force. But what if it's being funded by an external rival? A show of force will just make them dig in, supplied by an enemy you can't see. You're playing checkers with an opponent playing chess." Paused, her crimson eyes narrowing. You believe my strategy lacks subtlety. It was the opening he needed. I believe any strategy that doesn't account for internal threats is incomplete, he said, his voice low and even. A fortress can have the strongest walls in the galaxy and still fall if the gate guards are loyal to another master. He saw the immediate flash of anger in her eyes, her pride wounded by the implication. You dare suggest my own guard could be compromised, she hissed, the temperature in the room seeming to drop. You, a prisoner, presume to understand the intricacies of loyalty. Caleb stood his ground, meeting her furious gaze. I don't understand loyalty, Your Majesty. I understand military tactics. I understand security. And I know the difference between a functional security detail and a ceremonial honor guard. Your previous guards were the former. The ones who now patrol your halls are the latter. He proceeded to lay out his observations, not as accusations, but as a series of tactical data points. The change in personnel, the shift from ancestral cadre to division, the rigid and predictable patrol routes, the focus on appearance over awareness. They are a parade guard, Your Majesty. They are designed to look impressive, to make a show of protecting you. But their formations are vulnerable. Their attention is focused on their own perfection, not on external threats. They are a beautiful, polished shell around you, and a shell is designed to be broken from the outside or to hold something trapped within. Her fury did not subside. It hardened into a wall of imperial ice. To accept his warning would be to admit two catastrophic failures: that her own high general, the man she had placed in command of her armies, was a traitor, and that she, the queen, had been so blind she had not seen it herself, requiring a human prisoner to point it out. It was a political and personal humiliation she could not afford. Her voice was sharp, each word a shard of glass. You see shadows where there are none, human. You are projecting the petty treasons of your own fractured species onto an empire united by strength and honor. General's reforms of the Imperial Guard are a mark of his efficiency and his dedication to my security, not a sign of his treachery. You see a vulnerability because you think like a guerrilla, a creature of the shadows. My empire operates in the light. Your paranoia is a symptom of your own weakness, and I will not allow you to infect my court with it. She lashed out, her words a whip of contempt, not because she was entirely certain he was wrong, but because she could not bear the possibility that he was right. You are a prisoner, a tool. You will provide tactical analysis when I require it and keep your fanciful suspicions to yourself. Do you understand me? With that, she turned her back on him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and strode from the room, leaving him in a silence that was colder and more terrifying than any before. He had laid the truth at her feet, and she had refused to see it, blinded by the very pride and cultural arrogance that was now using as a weapon against her. He was alone, a prophet without honor, watching from his window as the perfectly polished, perfectly synchronized traders marched in the courtyard below, their every step a countdown to a bloody reckoning. The silence from the queen was a wall of ice between them for 2 full cycles, a period during which she did not visit, sending attendants instead with rations of alien fruit and cured meat that were clearly delicacies, but tasted like ash in Caleb's mouth. He knew his warning had not been entirely dismissed. It was a seed of doubt planted in the bedrock of her pride, an unwelcome truth that she could neither accept nor ignore. From his window, he continued his vigil, watching perfect soldiers march in the courtyard below, their flawless synchronicity a constant, chilling reminder of the coming storm. He spent his time methodically examining his opulent prison, not for comfort, but for weaknesses, for tools, for any possible advantage. The intricate metalwork of a massive floor brazier could, with enough effort, be loosed to serve as a lever. The power conduits for the glowing crystalline panels in the walls, though shielded, had a junction box that seemed to be a later addition, perhaps a flaw in the otherwise seamless design. He was a soldier behind enemy lines, and though the line was a single locked door, the principle remained the same. Map your terrain, identify your resources, and prepare for the moment when everything would inevitably fall apart. He had no illusions that he could fight his way out of the citadel, but he was determined that he would not die helpless in a cage, while a drama he had foreseen played out beyond the door. The day of the planetary alignment arrived with a palpable shift in the Citadel's energy. The air, always hot, grew thick with a strange electrical charge, and the light filtering through his window shifted from its usual angry orange to a deep, royal purple as three moons began their rare celestial convergence. He could hear the distant, resonant thrum of ceremonial gongs echoing through the mountain's stone heart, a sound that signaled the beginning of the ancient rites. This was the moment he had feared. A ceremony was the perfect cover for a coup, a time when tradition dictated procedures, when attention was focused on ritual, and when the Queen's guard would be at its most ceremonial and least alert. His hands, raw and bleeding, finally managed to wrench a meter-long decorative steel rod from the brazier's base, the screech of protesting metal a shocking intrusion into the chamber's quiet. It was heavy, poorly balanced, but it was a weapon, and more importantly, it was a tool. He went to the junction box for the wall panel, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the deep, slow beat of the ceremonial drums. He was no master engineer, but years of special forces training had taught him the basics of sabotage and improvisation. With the steel rod as a pry bar, he tore the faceplate from the box, exposing a cluster of thick, pulsing energy conduits. He knew this was his only chance. He would either short-circuit the door's locking mechanism or electrocute himself into a footnote in history. As stood in the grand antechamber of the Sunstone, the traditional site for the alignment ceremony, she felt a profound sense of unease that she angrily dismissed as the lingering effect of the human's paranoid ramblings. The chamber was open to the sky through a massive crystalline dome, and the aligned moons cast an ethereal purple glow upon the assembled nobles and her honor guard. Honor guard. The general himself stood at her right hand, his face a mask of pious devotion to the traditions of their people, his presence a suffocating weight. The ceremony required her to be unarmored, clad in traditional silken robes, her back to the main entrance for the rite's duration. It was a position of immense symbolic power and absolute tactical vulnerability, a tradition from a more honorable age that was now poised to exploit. The high priest began the final incantation, his voice a low drone that vibrated through the stone floor. It was then that the first blow came, not from an external assassin, but from the guard directly behind her. His ceremonial plasma lance suddenly reversed, its lethal end aimed at her spine. Her warrior's instincts, honed over 100 battles, screamed a fraction of a second before the attack. She pivoted, the silken robes swirling, deflecting the superheated point of the lance with her vambrace, the metal glowing white-hot from the near miss. The air filled with the stench of ozone and her own burning flesh, and the sacred ceremony erupted into a symphony of treachery and violence. The entire honor guard's hand-picked soldiers turned on her as one. Their perfect synchronized movements were no longer for ceremony but for a coordinated kill. Let out a roar of pure, primal fury, the sound of a cornered goddess, and met their charge head-on. She was unarmed, unarmored, but she was still a queen, a being of immense power and savage strength. She shattered the jaw of the first traitor with a single backhand, seized the plasma lance from another, and used it to impale two more in a single, brutal thrust. She moved with a terrible, beautiful grace, a whirlwind of golden skin and purple silk, fighting with a ferocity that stunned the assembled nobles into a state of terrified paralysis. But she was 1 against 10, all of them armed and armored, their movements a web of lethal precision designed to overwhelm her. Had vanished in the initial chaos, his part in the drama played, leaving his soldiers to complete the bloody work. They pressed their attack, forcing her back, their lances and plasma axes hemming her in, drawing blood with a dozen small cuts. A plasma bolt seared across her shoulder, and she faltered, a gasp of pain escaping her lips. They sensed her weakness and closed in, a circle of armored Judases ready to deliver the killing blow. It was in that moment of impending death that a section of the antechamber's ornate wall exploded inward in a shower of stone and sparks, and Caleb, his face blackened with soot and his eyes wild, burst into the room. He had managed to create a cascade failure in the power conduits, a surge of raw energy that had not only fried his door lock but blown the entire panel out of the wall. He had followed the sounds of combat, his makeshift steel club held in a white-knuckled grip, his senses on high alert. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second. Wounded and surrounded, the traitors moving in for the kill. He had no illusions about fighting these giants head-on. He had to change the equation. He spotted a massive, suspended incense burner, a behemoth of brass and burning coals held aloft by a thick chain. While the assassin's attention was on the queen, Caleb scrambled up a decorative pillar, ran along a ledge, and threw his entire weight against the chain's release mechanism. With a groan of tortured metal, the massive pendulum swung down, scattering the traitors and smashing two of them into bloody ruin against a far wall. The diversion gave the breathing room she needed. With a renewed roar, she surged forward, breaking their line and creating a new wave of chaos. Caleb dropped back to the floor, snatching a plasma rifle from a fallen guard. The weapon was immense, almost too heavy to lift, but he braced it against his hip, its alien ergonomics a nightmare to manage. A traitor, seeing this new, impossibly small threat, turned from the queen and charged at him, a massive plasma axe raised high. Caleb didn't try to outmaneuver him, he aimed for the floor. A single, superheated bolt struck the polished stone directly in front of the charging giant, vaporizing the surface into a cloud of molten slag and superheated gas. The screamed as his foot plunged into the molten pit, his charge ending in an agonized, off-balance tumble. The battle became a desperate, swirling melee. Was the Bastion, a whirlwind of brutal close-quarters combat, her fists and a stolen axe felling her giant foes. Caleb was the variable, the ghost on the periphery. He used the rifle not as a primary weapon, but as a tool. He fired at the crystal dome overhead, sending down a shower of razor-sharp shards that forced a group of guards to shield themselves, exposing their backs to furious assault. He targeted steam vents in the floor, a feature of the Citadel's geothermal heating, creating blinding clouds of vapor that obscured and broke up formations. He fought like a human, using ingenuity and the environment as his primary weapons, a chaotic and unpredictable force that the trained for direct confrontation could not seem to process. The last two traitors cornered against a pillar. One engaged her head-on while the other circled around, his plasma axe raised for the final decapitating blow. Locked in a deadly struggle with the first, could not see the flanking attack. Caleb saw it. He had a clear shot, but the rifle was nearly depleted, its energy cell sputtering. There would be no second chance. He took a breath, compensating for the weapon's weight and recoil, and fired. The bolt of plasma, smaller and weaker than the others, struck the assassin in the unprotected joint of his neck. The giant stiffened, a look of surprise on his face before collapsing in a heap. His final attack swung. Seeing her chance, dispatched the last remaining traitor with a final devastating blow. And then silence, broken only by the hiss of cooling plasma, the drip of blood, and the ragged sound of their breathing. Caleb stood 50 feet away, the heavy rifle finally slipping from his exhausted grasp. Bleeding from a dozen wounds, her silken robes torn and stained, slowly turned to face him. Her crimson eyes met his across the blood-soaked chamber, and in them he saw that the last vestiges of her arrogance, the last traces of her contempt, had been burned away, leaving behind a raw, stunned, and undeniable gratitude. He was no longer a curiosity, no longer a pet or a puzzle. He was the impossible variable that had just saved the throne, and in the fiery heart of the Citadel, a new and terrifying alliance was forged in blood and fire. In the bloody, silent aftermath of the failed assassination, the antechamber became the crucible for their new reality. The power dynamic had been irrevocably fractured and reforged. With a gesture that silenced the arriving loyalist guards, made her first command as a monarch reborn, not just by her own strength, but by an impossible alliance. Caleb was not returned to his gilded cage. Instead, he was escorted under her personal, unwavering gaze to a suite of chambers deep within her own royal wing, a sanctum so private that few, let alone an off, had ever seen its like. The chains were gone, replaced by the heavy, unspoken bond of a shared life-or-death struggle. Their first meeting in this new context was not one of captor and captive, but of two commanders surveying a battlefield after a costly, inconclusive skirmish. A medical droid, a terrifying apparatus of gleaming silver and humming generators, tended to her numerous wounds while she, ignoring its ministrations, stood before a holographic map of the Citadel, her focus entirely on the political and strategic nightmare had created. She acknowledged Caleb's presence with a sharp nod, her crimson eyes burning with a cold, controlled fire that was far more dangerous than her previous explosive rage. She understood now that her true enemy was not the battered human before her, but the smiling, loyal-faced traitor who commanded her armies. "He will deny everything," stated, her voice a low growl that was part pain and part fury as the droid sealed a deep gash on her arm. "The assassins were his men, but they are dead. Their loyalty will be painted as a fanatical, misguided attempt to purify the throne from your influence, an act for which he will feign regret while secretly applauding their conviction. He will lead the investigation himself, burying any evidence of his involvement so deep in the mountain that not even I could unearth it. To accuse him now, without irrefutable proof, would be to declare civil war. The military is loyal to the High General, the court respects his strength, and they would see my accusation as paranoia, the final proof that my association with you has made me unfit to rule." Her analysis was as sharp and brutal as her fighting style, a testament to a life spent navigating the treacherous currents of politics. She saw the trap she was in, a cage of tradition and perception that was far more effective than any physical prison. She was a queen with no legitimate moves left to make, a warrior forced into a stalemate where any direct action would mean her own destruction. Caleb listened, his gaze fixed on the holographic map, seeing not just a citadel but a chessboard. He saw the pieces, the lines of power, and the psychology of the opposing player, a psychology that, for all her intelligence, was too close to, too culturally ingrained with, to see as a weakness. "Then we don't give him a battle he can win," Caleb said, his voice cutting through her dark musings. "You're right, you can't challenge him on his terms. A direct accusation is political suicide. A military confrontation is civil war. You try to fight him the way, with honor and direct strength, and you will lose because he has already poisoned that battlefield against you. So, we have to make him fight on our terms. We have to create a battlefield he doesn't understand and cannot navigate." Turned from the map, her full attention on him, her skepticism warring with a desperate need for a solution. "What are you proposing, human? A war of whispers, of shadows? That is not the way." Caleb shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "No, not a war of whispers. A war of believes your association with me is your greatest weakness. He used it as the justification for his coup. So we are going to turn your perceived weakness into our greatest weapon. We are going to prove him right in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. We are going to make him believe you are so thoroughly broken, so completely corrupted by my influence, that he has no choice but to act rashly and expose himself." The sheer audacity of the plan hung in the air between them. To a for whom the projection of strength was as essential as breathing, feigning weakness, was a concept so alien it was almost sacrilegious. His initial reaction was a visceral recoil, a deep, instinctual rejection of a strategy that went against every fiber of her being. "You want me to parade my own dishonor before my court, to publicly debase myself and my throne by openly deferring to a prisoner. They will tear me apart, won't need to stage a coup. The nobles will hand him the crown themselves." Caleb stepped closer, his voice firm, insistent. "Yes, that's exactly what I want. And they won't tear you apart because you will frame it perfectly. You are the wounded queen, the survivor of a terrible betrayal by your own guard. You are shaken, your trust in your own people shattered. In your isolation, who do you turn to? The one person, the one outsider who saw the threat and warned you when no one else would. Me. It's a logical, even sympathetic narrative. You won't be seen as weak, but as cautious, wounded, and reliant on the only voice you know you can trust." His entire platform is built on his image as the pillar of strength and tradition. Nothing will infuriate him more, nothing will assault his ego more directly than seeing you, his queen, publicly taking strategic counsel from a creature he considers to be an insect. His pride will not allow it. He will be forced to act, not with subtle plotting, but with an open, public challenge that we can prepare for. She stared at him, her mind wrestling with the sheer, insane brilliance of the idea. It was a gambit so counterintuitive to her own nature that no would ever anticipate it. It was a plan born of a different kind of mind, a different species, approach to warfare, and in her desperation, she began to see the devastating potential it held. The plan began 2 cycles later. Convened the full court, ostensibly to report on the investigation into the rogue guards. She sat upon her throne, not with her usual unassailable posture but with a subtle, calculated weariness, leaning slightly as if her wounds still pained her. And beside the throne, in a position of shocking and unprecedented prominence, stood Caleb. He was clean, dressed in a simple, dark tunic that, while ill-fitting, was a vast improvement over his tattered fatigues. A wave of stunned, scandalized murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. High General, standing at the foot of the throne, went rigid, his face a mask of iron control that could not quite conceal the flash of pure, venomous rage in his eyes. When a noble questioned the human's presence, his voice was laced with a carefully crafted fragility. Caleb of Terra was the only one whose senses were sharp enough to perceive the treachery growing in my own shadow. While my decorated commanders saw only discipline, he saw conspiracy. His counsel is therefore of a value I can no longer afford to ignore. The statement was a thunderclap in the silent hall. For the next hour, during a debate on resource allocation for a distant mining colony, she would occasionally turn her head, inclining it towards Caleb, who would offer a few quiet words only she could hear, before she would render her judgment. It was a masterful piece of a public spectacle of reliance that sent shockwaves through the political structure of the empire. Night after night, they would meet in her private chambers, refining their strategy, a strange and intense intimacy growing between them in the crucible of their shared deception. He coached her on the nuances of appearing vulnerable without appearing incompetent, a fine line she struggled to walk. She, in turn, provided him with a deep, nuanced understanding of the personalities and ambitions of her court, teaching him who was loyal, who was ambitious, and who would follow the strongest wind. They were 2 minds from different ends of the galaxy, a warrior queen and a human soldier, working in perfect, focused synchronicity. During the day, they played their parts in the grand of the court, a spectacle that was driving slowly but surely to the edge of his sanity. The High General, a being of immense pride, was forced to stand by and watch as the creature he despised was elevated, his own counsel ignored in favor of the human's whispers. He could see his own political support beginning to waver, not because the nobles believed in Caleb, but because they saw a queen so detached from their traditions that she was becoming a liability. The situation was growing unstable, just as Caleb had predicted. Knew he had to act, to reassert his dominance, and the way before her madness, as he saw it, irrevocably shattered the empire's honor. The breaking point came during a military council meeting. When proposed a preemptive strike against a rival species, listened patiently before turning to Caleb. After a brief, whispered exchange, she overruled her High General. "Your plan is too aggressive, General. It risks a wider conflict. We will pursue a course of containment as per my advisor's recommendation." The public humiliation was total. His face became a thunderous mask of pure fury. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his ceremonial blade, and in a voice that boomed through the council chamber, he finally cast the die. "You are no longer fit to rule. Your mind is corrupted, your honor is a ghost, and you have disgraced the throne of your ancestors. I, High General of the Empire, do hereby challenge you to the right of command, to a trial by combat for the right to lead our people and restore the soul of our empire." The challenge, ancient and binding, hung in the air. The trap was sprung. The Grand Caldera was a place of myth and judgment, an arena carved by nature and consecrated by tradition. It was not a building but a wound in the planet's surface, a vast, circular depression whose floor was a sheet of cooled, black glass, spider-webbed with cracks through which the angry red heart of was visibly pulsing, a constant, silent testament to the world's primordial power. Tiers for spectators had been carved into the caldera's steep walls, and on this day, they were filled with the silent, watchful figures of the entire court, from the highest nobles to the lowest-ranking squad leaders, all gathered to witness the ultimate expression of their culture, a trial by combat for the throne itself. The air was thick with a mixture of volcanic heat and the electric tension of a species holding its collective breath. Upon a raised platform of obsidian, High General stood waiting, a figure of immaculate and terrifying strength, clad in gunmetal gray battle armor and holding a double-headed plasma axe that hummed with contained energy. He was the personification of tradition, the champion of the old ways, his confidence an arrogant aura that radiated across the arena. His victory, in the minds of many, was a foregone conclusion, a necessary and violent correction to a queen's disturbing deviation from the path of strength. In the cavernous preparation chamber behind the arena's great gates was not alone. The space was stark, functional, a place for warriors, not queens, and in its center Caleb stood before her, his expression a mask of intense, focused calm. The past cycle had been a blur of relentless preparation, a crash course in a new way of war, taught by a human to a demigod. He had spent hours with her, not teaching her how to fight, for she was a master of that, but teaching her how to think like her opponent. Using a holographic projector, he had displayed the battle records of every major engagement had ever commanded or fought in, stripping away the victorious narratives and reducing them to pure, cold data. He showed her the patterns, the undeniable, arrogant consistency in his approach to any conflict. "He is a hammer," Caleb had explained, his finger tracing the blunt, straightforward assault vectors on the hologram. "He sees every problem as something to be smashed. He believes in overwhelming force, in breaking his opponent's guard and their will with relentless, powerful attacks. He has never faced an opponent he couldn't simply overpower, so he has never learned any other way. His greatest strength, his absolute offensive power, is also his greatest weakness. He overcommits. On every third or fourth major swing, he puts his entire body into the blow, leaving himself momentarily unbalanced, his flank exposed for a fraction of a second. It's a flaw he doesn't even know he has, because no he has ever fought has been quick enough or unorthodox enough to exploit it." He had spent the rest of their time not training her in human martial arts, which would have been useless given their difference in scale, but drilling a single, alien concept into her warrior's mind, the principle of strategic yielding. He made her practice a maneuver that felt deeply unnatural to her, a move that was not about meeting force with force but about redirecting it. It was a fluid, rotational pivot, a move that used the opponent's own momentum as a weapon, drawing them in and past, turning their aggressive energy against them. It was a piece of tactical elegance, a fencer's logic applied to a titan's brawl, and it was a concept so completely foreign to the martial ethos that it felt like a form of cowardice to her at first. Caleb was relentless, forcing her to practice the footwork again and again, showing her how the pivot would not only protect her but would create the very opening they needed. Now, as the ceremonial gongs signaled the start of the duel, he stood before her as she donned the final plate of her battle armor. "He will expect you to meet him head-on, a storm of fury against his storm of steel," Caleb said, his voice low and steady amidst the rising tension. "You must be the mountain. You must endure. Let him exhaust his rage against your shield. Let his arrogance be the weapon that defeats him. Wait for the overswing. You will only get one chance." She looked down at him, her crimson eyes filled with a mixture of grim determination and a deep, unsettling trust. She, a queen who had never trusted anyone but herself, was about to stake her life, her throne, and her empire on the tactical theories of an alien prisoner. She placed a hand, a massive gauntlet of black steel on his shoulder, a gesture of profound and startling intimacy. "If I fall, they will tear you to pieces," she said, her voice a low rumble. "I do not intend to fall," was all he replied. The great gates opened and strode into the grand caldera, the purple light of the aligned moons glinting off her polished black armor. She carried a massive, unadorned shield and a single-edged power sword, a practical warrior's that stood in stark contrast to more ornate and aggressive weaponry. The duel began not with a charge, but with a challenge from, his voice amplified by his helmet's speakers to fill the arena. "For the honor of the Empire, which you have so carelessly discarded." He boomed and then he attacked, a blur of gray armor and crackling green plasma. He was everything Caleb had promised, a whirlwind of destruction, a relentless series of powerful, cleaving blows designed to shatter her guard and end the fight quickly. His plasma axe swung in wide, devastating arcs, each impact against her shield sending a deafening clang and a shower of sparks across the arena floor, and to the shock of the entire assembled court, did not counterattack. She did not meet his fury with her own. She became the mountain. She gave ground, absorbing his blows, her feet planted, her shield a bulwark of absolute defense. Her movements were economical, efficient, focused solely on survival, weathering a storm that would have annihilated any other warrior. The initial shock of the spectators quickly morphed into a rising murmur of confusion and disdain. This was not how a queen fought. This was the tactic of a coward, a weakling. Tu was initially surprised, but his surprise quickly turned to smug certainty. He saw her defensive posture not as a strategy, but as proof of his accusations. Her spirit was broken, her warrior's heart corrupted by the human's influence. He pressed his attack with even greater ferocity, his blows becoming more powerful, more reckless, his arrogance feeding his strength. He was winning, and he wanted the entire empire to see him dominate the queen who had shamed him. But Caleb, watching from a high vantage point among the nobles, saw something else. He saw his controlled breathing, the subtle shifts of her weight as she absorbed and redistributed the kinetic force of his attacks. He saw the growing frustration in his body language, the slight hitch in his movements as his initial burst of energy began to wane against her unyielding defense. He was a hammer trying to smash the ocean, and the effort was beginning to exhaust him. For long, grueling minutes, the pattern continued, a brutal, one-sided assault that was, in reality, a carefully controlled trap. Shield arm ached with a fire that went bone-deep, her armor was dented and scorched, and her entire body screamed in protest. But she held the line, her mind focused on Caleb's words, her eyes watching, waiting for the inevitable mistake. Then it came. Fueled by a final, desperate surge of arrogant rage at her refusal to break, put everything into a single, massive overhead swing. He roared, lifting the massive plasma axe with both hands, a move of such overwhelming power that it was meant to cleave her shield, her armor, and her body in two. It was the ultimate overcommitment, the final, fatal miscalculation of a warrior who had never been taught the meaning of restraint. In that fraction of a second, as the humming green blades of the axe began their descent, moved, she did not retreat. She did not try to block. She executed the move that was anathema to her very nature. With a fluid, powerful grace that stunned the entire arena into silence, she pivoted on her back foot, her entire 15-foot frame rotating away from the blow. Axe, aimed at where she had been, now met only empty air. Its momentum, vast and unchecked, tore him off balance, pulling him forward and past her, his body a helpless victim of his own misspent fury. For a single breathtaking moment, his flank, his back, his entire being was utterly and completely exposed. Did not hesitate. The mountain became an avalanche. As stumbled past, she reversed the direction of her own spin, her power soared, held in reserve for this one perfect instant, describing a single vicious arc. It was not a blow of brute force, but of perfect timing and placement. The humming blade sliced through the unarmored power conduits at the back of his cuirass, and his plasma axe died with a pathetic fizzle. She slammed the flat of her shield into his back, sending him sprawling onto the black glass floor. Before he could even process his failure, she was upon him, the point of her sword at his throat. The entire duel, from his final, furious roar to his humiliating defeat, had taken less than 3 seconds. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the grand caldera. Then, her voice ringing with renewed and unquestionable authority, pronounced his judgment. "Your strength is a hollow stone," she declared, throwing his own blasphemous insult back at the court. "And your honor is a ghost." Her victory was absolute, one not just with strength but with a human's mind. Across the arena her gaze found Caleb, and in that silent, shared look, a throne was not just won, but a partnership was forged in steel and fire. The silence in the grand caldera was a physical entity, a vacuum of sound that pressed in on the thousands of assembled, a silence deeper and more profound than any had ever experienced in that hallowed place of judgment. Queen stood bathed in the ethereal purple light, her blade held steady at its throat, her breath coming in slow, controlled waves. Her victory had been so swift, so precise, and so utterly alien in its execution that the court was left stunned, their entire understanding of strength and honor shattered in a single, elegant pivot. Lay sprawled on the obsidian floor, his magnificent armor useless, his humming plasma axe now a cold, dead weight, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief. He had been defeated not by a superior force, but by a superior logic, a humiliation so complete that death would have been a mercy. But mercy, had learned, was not always a swift end. Sometimes it was a long, hard lesson. She retracted her sword, the hum of its power cell a jarring sound in the stillness, and looked out not at, but at the sea of crimson eyes watching her from the tiered seats of the arena. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the roar of a triumphant warrior but the clear, cold tone of a monarch remaking her world, each word a chisel striking a new law into the stone of their tradition. For his treason, for his arrogance, and for his failure to see beyond the edge of his own axe, I sentence not to an honorable death in combat, but to life. He will be stripped of his title, his rank, and his name. He will serve the empire he sought to fracture as a laborer in the deepest mines of Tartarus 6, a world where the only measure of a man is the weight of the rock he can haul. He sought to remind me of the strength of the mountain. He will now spend the rest of his days learning that lesson from the inside out. A wave of shock, more potent than even her victory had produced, rippled through the caldera. It was a judgment of unprecedented cruelty and breathtaking brilliance. To kill him would be to make him a martyr for the traditionalists. To condemn him to a life of anonymous, honorless toil was to erase him from their history, to turn a demigod of war into a cautionary tale whispered to unruly children. It was a political execution, not a physical one, and it was a clear, unmistakable signal to her entire empire. The old ways, the ways of the hammer, were over. The age of the mind had begun. The subsequent transition of power was not a bloody purge, but a quiet, seismic shift in the political landscape of the citadel. The throne room, once a place of rigid hierarchy and simmering rivalries, became a forum of tense but productive uncertainty. The nobles and commanders who had tacitly supported ambitions now found themselves on unstable ground, forced to navigate a new political reality where brute strength and an honorable bloodline were no longer the sole currencies of power. With Caleb always a quiet, observant presence at her side, did not execute them. Instead, she tested them, presenting them with the same kinds of complex logistical and strategic problems she and Caleb had debated in the privacy of her chambers. She promoted those who showed adaptability, cunning, and a willingness to think beyond traditional doctrine, and she marginalized those who could not, creating a new court based on merit and intellect, not just on might. It was during a full session of this new council that she formalized Caleb's position, an act that finally cemented the revolution he had started. She created a new title, one that had never existed in the lexicon, strategic adjunct to the throne. He was no longer a prisoner, an advisor, or a strange royal favorite. He was an official, integrated part of the imperial command structure, a permanent fixture in the government. The pronouncement was met with a stunned but telling silence. There was no outrage, no challenge. They had all witnessed the result of his strategic council in the Grand Caldera, and while his presence was a stark deviation from their traditions, his value was now an undeniable, proven fact. He was the human who had taught their queen a new way to win, and in the pragmatic heart of the empire, victory was the only truth that ultimately mattered. That night in the quiet sanctum of her personal chambers, the weight of empires and politics finally fell away, leaving only the two of them, a man and a woman from different stars, bound together by a shared history of violence, survival, and revolution. The massive window showed them the fiery, beautiful chaos of surface, a reflection of the tumult they had navigated and finally calmed. Stood before him, not as a queen or a warrior, but simply as herself, her immense form filling the space with a presence that was no longer intimidating, but simply familiar. The obsession she had felt for the creature who had humiliated her, the respect she had developed for the soldier who had saved her, and the reliance she had placed on the advisor who had secured her throne, had all coalesced into a single, profound, and deeply terrifying emotion, one for which her language of war and conquest had no adequate word. She took a slow, deliberate step towards him, and then another before doing something that would have been more shocking to her court than anything she had done in the caldera. She knelt. She brought her incredible height down, not in submission, not in defeat, but in a gesture of deliberate and profound equality until her crimson eyes, filled with a fire that was no longer rage but a burning, tender light, were level with his. "The first time you made me kneel," she said, her voice a low, resonant murmur that was for him alone, "it was the greatest shame of my life. I wanted to tear the galaxy apart to erase the memory of it." She reached out her hand, a thing of impossible size and strength, and gently with a control he knew was monumental, she cupped his face, her thumb stroking his cheek. "But now I find that I would kneel 1,000 times, Caleb of Terra, if it means I can see you as I see you now." It was in that moment of breathtaking vulnerability, of a queen's final, willing surrender not to an enemy but to a partner, that Caleb understood the full measure of his own journey. He was a soldier of the Terran Alliance, a man whose entire life had been defined by his duty to his people, a people who were still technically at war with the golden giantess kneeling before him. He thought of his comrades, of the lives they had given, and of the home he had once fought so desperately to protect. A few days prior, a coded message had reached him, a whisper through the void from Alliance intelligence, a miracle of deep space communication offering him a single, high-risk chance at extraction. He had the opportunity to go home. He could return a hero, bringing with him an unprecedented wealth of intelligence on the Empire. But as he looked into his eyes, he saw a different future, a different kind of duty. He could return to being a weapon in a war that would likely rage for generations, a conflict that would cost billions of lives on both sides. Or he could stay here, at the heart of the storm, and guide it, calm it, and perhaps with her, finally end it. He realized that the greatest service he could do for humanity was not to fight but to teach them, to build a bridge from this throne room to the wider galaxy, a bridge founded on the respect and understanding that he had forged in fire. He covered her hand with his own, a small, pale thing against her radiant gold. "I am not Caleb of Terra anymore," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had long thought buried. "My home is here now, with you." Their lives found a new rhythm, a partnership that was both personal and political. They became a single, formidable ruling entity, a perfect fusion of strength and human ingenuity. The days were spent in the council chambers, reshaping the empire's policies, their debates a quiet, intellectual dance that left her nobles in constant, grudging admiration. The nights were their own, a time of quiet conversation, of shared meals, of two vastly different beings learning the contours of each other's minds and hearts, the immense difference in their physical forms becoming an irrelevant, endearing detail in the face of their profound connection. The final, definitive proof of their new era came during a council meeting to discuss a silicon-based species on their empire's border whose territory they had been planning to conquer for its rare mineral wealth. The old would have ordered an invasion without a second thought. The new, after a long, silent look at Caleb, turned to her stunned commanders and gave a revolutionary command. "Prepare a diplomatic envoy," she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that no one dared question. "We will open negotiations. We will offer to trade for their resources, not take them. It is time the Empire learned to build bridges, not just burn them." The story ends not with a great battle or a clash of fleets, but in the quiet of the royal chambers. Caleb stood on a permanent, elegantly carved dais beside her favorite observation window, a simple architectural addition that forever solved the disparity in their heights. They stood side by side, equals in every way that mattered, looking out at the fiery, untamed beauty of. He had been dragged to this world in chains, a prisoner brought low, but in a strange and beautiful irony, his captivity had liberated a queen, and in doing so had freed them both. Their war was over, and a new, far more interesting and hopeful future was just beginning, a future they would face not as human and not as captive and queen, but as partners, ready to show the galaxy that the greatest strength is not the power to conquer, but the wisdom to understand.